Is what you see my screen all right? Everything's good?
Yeah, we
All
see it
right.
great. Thank you,
Okay.
Jermaine.
All right, so just to go over a couple of quick agenda items. First, I'll talk a little bit about some of the learning objectives for later. And then over the course of today's class, we'll talk about integrated pest management and the different components that make it up. We'll talk about scouting and identification, so how to find and identify pests, talking about, we'll also talk about methods of control, and then follow up with the different types of pests you're likely to encounter in your farm or garden in this DC area, including some small insect and plant and disease pests, and then ranging all the way up to large animal pests. And then I'll leave you guys with some IPM resources. So just to go over the student learning objectives. So over this course, we'll cover, over the class today, we'll cover these different topics. So defining what integrated pest management is, go through the different methods of control, talk a little bit about the basics of scouting, and what are some of the thresholds to consider before controlling a pest. Um, talk about how to use a scouting sheet, and as well as discuss different pests in the DC area. All right, so what is integrated pest management? And so integrated pest management is pretty much just an ecosystem-based strategy. And two of the core things about this is it focuses on long-term prevention of pests rather than a short-term reactive spray solution. So this is a long-term cyclic program that you iterate year after year, and you kind of tweak it each additional year. Um, so under integrated pest management, it's combining multiple methods of control. So that includes biological control, cultural controls, physical, and as a last resort, chemical controls. And so pesticides are only used after monitoring indicates they're needed. So again, IPM is based on comparing pest to thresholds and then using that to come in with something reactive like a pesticide. And so thresholds, they're based on established thresholds. So this is typically an extension, or you can develop this yourself. And then under IPM, treatments are made with the goal of removing only the targeted pests. IPM emphasizes managing pests rather than eradicating them. Um, so there's levels of pests that your garden or farm can tolerate and where they're not economically important. Um, and so it reiterates that some damage on your plants is okay or it's tolerable. And so one of the problems with traditional pest control is in the past, the standard for farming or growing crops was see a bug, spray a bug. It's very reactive, and it didn't really consider what else was being affected by insecticides or where those insecticides or herbicides might be going. And so there was a reliance on calendar or routine sprays. So, some folks used to March 15th, that's the day we're spraying, regardless of if we know how many pests are out there or not. And so this can have quite a bit of problems, right? And so we know now that pesticides can, travel from when they're applied. So it can have risks to beneficial and non-target species. So your pollinators, your mammals, humans can get into water sources and have effects there. We could get in the soil and contaminate the soil. Um, and another big issue with traditional pest control or this kind of standardized spraying is that pests can develop resistance over time. And we call this the pesticide treadmill. So how do pests develop resistance? So typically, when you go outside and you see before you're doing any pest control, you have a number of pests out there, and in that population you have susceptible ones and resistant ones to any control that you're going to do. So like say for this example, we're doing sprays on these aphid looking creatures. So in this first generation, before there's any pesticide application, this red one, it would be resistant to that chemical you apply, let's say chemical A, right? And so what you do when you apply that pesticides, it will kill the susceptible ones. Maybe one or two susceptible ones might escape the spray, but the resistant ones hang around. And so your population for next time is now, you kind of increase the amount of resistance insect here after applying that pesticide. So whereas it was 1 in, let's say 10, it's now 1 in 3. And so these resistant ones over generations can become more apparent in the population by breeding, passing on resistant genes. And so when you spray again, you'll be selecting against those susceptible ones and more for resistant ones. And so to recap, so few resistant individuals can survive due to natural resistance, so those red ones. When you spray, it will select to keep those resistant ones. And remember, a lot of pest insects tend to reproduce very fast. And so you can quickly see an increase in resistant species over a matter of years or even decades. Um, and so when the surviving resistant individual reproduce over many generations, you'll see more and more resistant ones versus in the beginning where there were many susceptible ones. And so you consider a population resistant when it can survive rates of pesticide that previously control it. So now if you have to up the dose or up the frequency of your applications to keep that same level of pest control. So that's how pests can develop resistance to routine spraying. So what are the benefits to the integrated approach, right? And so instead of relying on that one type, just chemical, it brings in others types of control, like biological, cultural control, so managing the environment. And so the IPM method, it promote it. Some of the benefits of this approach is promoting healthy plants. So remember, um, last class we talking about making the environment plant positive and and pest negative. So another thing is it promotes biological management of pests. So leaning on natural pest management that's going on in the background can reduce the need for pesticide due to all of these other processes working. Can reduce your risk of pesticides to the humans and the environments. A lot of pesticides are involved in class action lawsuits now or tied up in lawsuits, things like glyphosate and things like that. There's a reduced potential for environmental contamination with these insecticides. Integrated pest management protects non-target species and reduces those re-entry intervals. So after you spray a pesticide, you might have to stay out the field for certain re-entry periods. So if you're putting in less pesticides, then those are reduced as well. But there are also challenges to the integrated pest management approach, right? And so whereas you're mixing different control tactics and you have to do identification and these different steps, some of the challenges includes that it could be knowledge intensive. It requires you to know about your cropping system. What are you putting in? What are the potential pests of it? What are the natural enemies that are likely to come? So you have to know a little bit more about your system. And this could be through experience, through peer-to-peer learning, extension resources. So it requires careful monitoring and record keeping, the longer time to establish and implement. There's a lot more management, and some approaches are weather dependent, right? And so if you do something like a row cover, for example, you have to remove it so pollinators can come in. So where is IPM useful? IPM is useful wherever there are pests. So in rural and urban environments, so in forest trees where there might be boring beetles and things that are pests to some of the trees in native trees, on farms. So you have agricultural pests that are attacking produce and things like that. But also in rural and urban areas, so urban farms, urban structures, and things like that. So again, IPM is useful wherever there are pests. So a lot of these gardens and landscaping, we know the usual suspects like Japanese beetles and all kind of things that can get in here and cause problems. There's different diseases, weeds like dandelions and things like that that can be a nuisance or um, in our landscaping areas. Um, IPM is also useful in and around buildings, right? And so from the urban perspective, where pests are in homes and schools and hospitals, so things like termites attacking the structure of buildings, You know, we've all heard about bed bugs in the recent years, bed bugs, you know, in housing developments and hotels and things like that. Um, my rodents and rats and things. So, you know, there's IPM programs for all different kinds of pests. It's just, you know, mixing up your control tactics to attack the pests on multiple fronts. So just to go briefly overview the key principles of IPM. So there's generally 5 to 6 steps, and they include the same kind of process. So the first is you want to identify and monitor the pests that are in your garden or your building or farm or whatever you have. Then you want to make sure that whatever you have is properly identified so you can know that whatever treatments you're going to use are going to work on that. And you want to assess the threat. You know, is this enough of a problem to warrant the energy, the cost, or the risk of whatever controls you're using? Then 3 is learning the pest biology. So once you identify what it is and start to get an idea of how much of a threat it is, you want to learn the pest biology. What time of year does it come around? What are its likes and dislikes? And then you could determine your action threshold. How much of this are you willing um, um, to take or take the cost of, right? And so after that, you choose appropriate tactics. What am I going to implement to control this? And so towards the end of the year, you want to evaluate how those controls were and just the general effectiveness of your controls for that year or growing season. And so this is just another figure that's giving an overview of that process, right? And so IPM is a science-based approach that combines a variety of techniques. So by studying life cycles and how pests interact with the environment, IPM professionals can manage pests with most current methods to improve management, lower costs, and reduce risk to people in the environment. And so again, you know, that identify and monitor phase, evaluation phase. So is this a threat? You know, what are some preventative tactics we can use? Um, you know, what actions are we going to use? And then how can we monitor and evaluate the program, you know, in an iterative or cyclical way year after year and improve it each year? So now that I've given a quick overview of and definition of what IPM is, I want to talk a little bit about the scouting and identification process. So that first step in the IPM process. And so first is inspecting and monitoring. So what is monitoring? And that's essentially just regular sampling for pests and their life signs, right? And so we, in the entomology class, we talked about the different life stages of insects. So we remember egg, larvae, so 1 to 3rd instars or 5th instars. Then there was a pupae and holometabolous or complete development insects, and then in hemimetabolous insects, no pupae, and then both have an adult form. And so each of these stages can key you into what pests, you know, it can help you identify what pests you have, the timing of the pests, and what kind of damage they're doing, right? Because we talked about the mouth parts, chewing mouth parts versus sucking mouth parts, and what that might look like when you're out there scouting your garden or your field. So you want to do inspecting and monitoring to kind of get an early detection of any pests that are coming in before they can get a chance to establish and become a problem. So for this routine, scouting is important. You want to get in the habit of doing it, you know, every day or every other day, weekly. You want to set up a weekly schedule or a regular schedule to make sure you're kind of checking in with these things. And so during this inspecting and monitoring process, one of the important things is collecting and recording anything of concern. And so where do we want to look when we're scouting? So on plants, you're looking at the upper and undersides of leaves. Remember, insects like to camouflage and they like to get into nooks and crannies to hide from potential predators, including you as a human that wants to, you know, get rid of it. So check the upper and undersides of leaves. You want to check the stems, up and down the stems for any presence of insects. You want to check the soil around your plant. Lots of insects like to fall off the plant during the day and burrow into the soil so they can hide out. Um, and then even inside the flowers, a lot of time in hot summers, insects will hide out in flowers. Japanese beetles you can find in there, in cucurbits. Cucumber beetles like to hide out in cucurbit flowers. And and since it's a UDC, you want to check for pests in cracks and crevices around buildings or structures. You want to check for unsanitary areas, so overgrown areas or areas with food refuse or trash where pests could find a food source or a refuse source. Right. And so we talked about the kind of resources beneficial insects need. So pests are just taking much more advantage of those resources, right? And so if you have food areas, that's likely to be a place where you might see rats and roaches because lots of food is available. Some useful tools for the scouting and monitoring process. So just in general, you want a camera. um, Cell phone is good nowadays, can take good close-up pictures of insects. um, if you're outside, you want maybe a magnifying glass or a hand lens so you could get in close and identify important parts of an insect or weed. You want a clipboard with paper and pencil. You can even log this in notes apps. You want to record anything you might see. Um, for observing and monitoring, you also have sticky traps. That's a good way to monitor for flying insects that they'll think this yellow card is a flower and get stuck to it. And by checking up the amount of insects that are stuck to it and swapping it out, you can get a vague idea of how many insects are coming in or what stage. Um, Outdoors, hand trowel to dig up soil to check the soil for pests or weed seeds and things like that. Scissors, clippers, anything to take a leaf sample that you could collect, turn it into extension to identify a disease or something like that. Indoors, flashlights, telescopic mirrors, or maps of diagrams of the unit can clue you into where insects might be hiding or where you need to check. Roaches and rats like to hide in cracks and crevices. So, a telescopic mirror can allow you to see under a cabinet or drawer or whatever to see for any eggs or things like that. Um, just some general scouting tips. So it's important to routinely monitor for pests. So you want to make sure to set up a routine. You want to begin when plants start growing and pests are active. So often in this area, it's May. Um, Sorry, it's May. It's in early spring, like around May, um, is when a lot of pests are starting to become active. So this is a good time to get out instead of routine. Scouting may depend on the pest life cycle. Some pests are nocturnal, so you may have to scout at night or at dusk. Other other times you can scout early in the morning. So again, select and stick to a regular scouting interval. And so carefully look for signs of pests. So any life stage, you're talking about eggs, larvae, adults, weed seedlings, weed flowers, any abnormal rusts or growths on your plants, signs of disease. So in your larger areas like gardens or backyards or fields, you want to do a random sample to make sure you're not kind of missing areas of your field, right? And so to do this, aim for even representation of your samples. And typically in a square field or something like this, you could do a W pattern and randomly sample, over the course of the W, or you could choose an X pattern and you a random sample kind of the edges and the interiors of that box. So when you're scouting, you want to make sure to document, keep notes, and take receipts. Scout sheets and scout journals can help. And so I have a couple example scouting sheets here. So a lot of these are online. I think I found this through University of Vermont. And so a scouting sheet has key pieces of important data. So things like location, where were you when you were observing for pests? Who is the person that was observing? So if it's not you, another, and someone else does it, you can check in with them so they could confirm what they saw. the date. So the date keys you into what time of the year these pests were active, what crops were they on, can gives you an idea of the host or where they might be using for refuge. Um, what's the plant or pest growth stage? So if it's a weed, is it seedling? Is it, how far along is it towards flowering and setting seeds? If it's a pest, is it an adult form or is it an egg form? It gives you an idea of what stage your of the pest you have. And then the weather is also important because a lot of insects, diseases are mediated by weather. So the weather can, keeping weather records can kind of help you keep paint a clearer picture of what's going on. Again, pictures are a great help. Many pictures, clear pictures can really help your extension or whoever specialist is helping you confirm an ID. Here's another scouting diagram. This one is like a farm one. See, it has a field map. It has separate box for weeds, so growth stage, pressure or density, so how many per quarter meter square or whatever. The insects, diseases, the scouting sheet to help you, in a neat and organized way, take care of all of that information. And if you want some ideas, University of Massachusetts and Michigan State Extension has some more information on scouting diagram and different worksheets you can use. Um, some more scouting resources through Penn State Extension. This Pest Watch website has useful fact sheets for specific pests that you can browse. And then NIWA has a growing degree day calculator. A lot of pests can be forecasted with degree days. And so this can help you see if it's time for, corn earworm or something to be active. So, these are useful resources that you can use somewhere down the line. The next part is proper identification. So as part of proper identification, you want to correctly identify the pest. So, assess if the pest if it's a pest or a threat. It helps you inform your controls. And so why is identification important? Because applying control based on a wrong identification can cost you, right? If you go out there and spray the wrong pesticide for the wrong pest, it may not be effective, and you may inadvertently hit your non-targets like your beneficials, and it could result in an ineffective control that you paid for, and it could worsen pest problems. It can harm beneficial insects. Um, and then again, proper identification, it helps determine if pests are at concerning levels. Um, you avoid unnecessary costs and avoid unnecessary costs of that control. Um, so after confirming a pest, you want to learn about its biology and life cycles. So this could tell you timing of pest activity. So what time of the year, what months should you expect it, so you can get ahead, or through your planning you can prepare for it. You can learn about behaviors and preferences through proper identification. Helps you determine if pest is a threat. So one pest sighting is not necessarily indicative of a threat. It could be just passing through, or it could just be, a non-pest species. Many pests exist at non-damaging levels, but it's not until you get to a concerning level where you want to knock them back. And again, healthy plants can tolerate some damage. And with IPM, intervention is only needed when pests approach damaging levels. So insect pest outbreaks or abundant weed seedlings, and a high number of plants affected with disease. So I have an example of why proper identification is important, right? And so both of these insects, insect A and insect B, are both commonly found in gardens, on farms, on plants. One of them is a beneficial predator, and the other is an economically important pest. So this can cause economic damage to your plants. Does anybody want to type in chat and guess type in chat who thinks A is the beneficial predator? They're both types of stink bugs. So go ahead and just type your vote in chat whether you think the beneficial predator is A or B. All right, so we got 6 A's and 2 B's. 6 A's, 3 B's. All right, let's go with that. All right, so let's do a quick activity. All right, so how do you identify or confirm an identification? For these, we have insect keys. And so um, this is the key to stink bugs common in this DC area. This is the brown marmorated stink bug. Some of its characteristics are rounded shoulders, white bands antennae and legs, alternating light and dark bands on the sides of the abdomen. We have the green stink bug, which is not brown. It tends to be smaller than the brown marmorated stink bug. We have the brown stink bug, which has sharp shoulders, but its antennae lacks the black and white bands. And then you have the spine soldier bug, which is a beneficial insect, but it has sharp shoulders, and its antennae lack those white bands. And so let's take a look at A, right? And so um, looking at the antenna has those black and white bands and it's on its antenna, right? And so, well, that's one of the key characteristics of brown marmorated stink bug. But you don't only want to just use one characteristic. So what else, right? It has rounded shoulders. This one has fairly rounded shoulders. And then alternating dark and light bands on the side of abdomen, right? And so A is a brown marmorated stink bug. That's a pest. So what's B? Let's see what this is, right? And so it does not have these black and white antennae on its black and white bands on the antennae, and it has these sharp shoulders. So this right here is actually a spine soldier bug. And so this is them in their environment, right? So this is a brown marmorated stink bug eating an apple or something like that. You see its mouth part, the piercing, sucking mouth part right into that apple. So that's crop damage. Here, on the other hand, you know, if you thought A was the beneficial insect, that's attacking your crop. You thought B was the beneficial insect. You're right. This is a Colorado potato beetle larva, and this is the spine soldier beetle with the needle right in it. So this is biocontrol right here. This is a good guy. So this is one of those illustrations of why it's very important to know what you're treating before you treat it. And just some resources to help with pest IDs, Bug Guide, iNaturalist, UMD Extension. You know, these are all links that you could click at your leisure when you have this presentation. Another thing you want to do, kind of learn the pest biology. So after confirming a pest, you want to learn about its biology and life cycle. So timing of the pest activity, you want to learn behaviors and preferences. So, you know, what crops does it like versus dislike? What are some of the relevant life stages? And what are its habitat and development needs? And so one of the things I want to show is the example of trap cropping, right? And so over here, you have a cash crop. These are a type of squash. And then over here, you have blue Hubbard squash that are planted. Blue Hubbard squash are way more attractive to cucumber beetles than the cash crop because it has a higher levels of this protein called of a compound called cucurbitacin. So if you want to lure away your cucumber beetles from your cash crops, you can plant this blue Hubbard squash on the edge, and a lot of the pests will be attracted to this area instead of this area, the Sparrow crops. And in terms of IPM, you know, in a way to reduce pesticide, you can just spray this edge rather than, you know, using spray on the entire thing. You know, so IPM may undermine pest requirement. In this case, trap crops can mislead pests. And so this last section I want to talk about before the break is the assessing the threat component, right? And so when do you know your insect is a threat? So the main goal of IPM is to control pests while minimizing environmental and economic losses. You want to intervene when monitored pests are approaching economic or intolerable levels. And so I want to introduce a few terms here: the economic injury level and economic thresholds. So these are two concepts when we were trying to determine whether pest densities are economically damaging. And so the economic injury level is the pest density. So it's a number of pests per area. So number of aphids on a leaf or something like that. So the pest density or degree of injury that results in economic loss. So at this level, so let me finish this defining the terms and I'll walk through the chart. The economic threshold is the population density at which you should put in a control to prevent the pest from reaching that damaging level. And so these thresholds incorporate knowledge of the pest, crop development, the crop's value, and the timing of the crop and the pest. And so looking at this chart, this is the number of pests, so that pest density, and this is time over the season. So that economic injury level, so at this level, if a pest gets to this level, it's gonna start costing you money. And at the economic threshold, this is where you want to apply your treatment to control a pest before it gets to that outbreak level, right? And so when you, and so, you know, so the red line is the pest abundance. So over the course of the season, as it's going up, it's reaching that economic injury level. But your economic threshold is that the level you want to come in and do your control. So if you do your control here, at this economic threshold, it will slow the pest development and put it below and slow it and kind of reverses that trend from it continuing on to the injury level. And so if you didn't come in here with a control, this pest would have skyrocketed into the economic injury level. And so above this economic injury level, the benefit of your control is going to be better, is going to be more valuable than the cost. So you want to control here. But below this economic injury level, the cost is not worth the benefit. And again, so pests become damaging after breaching economic thresholds with no control. So at this point, so this is pest number that's rising over the course of the growing season. And at a certain point, you want to have those stops, those checks and balances in place to kind of repel the insect numbers. And if it doesn't happen at this point, it's going to continue into becoming an economic problem. And so consider this delay in time as your controls take time to work, right? So if it's a pesticide spray, that might have a quicker time. But if you're releasing biocontrol agents and they have to seek out and find pests, that might take a longer time to take place. And to find or establish these extension thresholds, you can consult with extension, you can look up growing guides and things like that to help you come up with one. And so I want to stop there for this portion before moving on. In part two, we're going to talk about just the different methods of control and how it plays out and how you choose tactics in the IPM program. But I think I would stop right here. Does anyone have any questions?
Could you put back?
Sorry, Leslie, you go. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I just was going to say, could you please go back? Yes. Thank you.
You just want to see it, or do you have a question?
I just want to see it and absorb it.
Okay. Oh yeah, sorry. So again, so you have the number of pests on this axis. So, your number of aphids going up, and then this is time. So it could be days or weeks, months, the growing season. And so let's say you have aphid numbers on a plant. They start out very low, but then they start to explode, right? And if you don't do a lady beetle treatment or insecticide treatment, they're gonna explode to a level to where they start to affect the health of your plant. And then they're going. So this is kind of that two-spotted spider mite example from last time, where they webbed up the plant and it kind of burns out. So that's at that point. So the representation on this graph is this point, that injury level, where the pest became an economic problem. And so there was a point, either days or weeks before that, where you'd have to come in with your insecticide or your biocontrol to help reduce the number of pests before they can reach that level. And if successful, it will drop their population. So they'll have to start again. One of the things to notice about this is cultural controls will generally raise the threshold, right? And so if you have diversity, where there's no monoculture, your threshold for damage is gonna be higher because your pests are having a hard time finding the plant, so they're slower to establish and things like that. So by using cultural controls, you can raise, or lack of cultural controls can lower this bar. Stress can lower this bar. So stress plants can deal with less insects before it starts to become economically damaging.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Is the blue writing near the time, it says below EIL, should that be below ET? Cost is greater than benefit?
No, the economic injury level, because the economic injury level is when it becomes damaging, and under it, it's when it's not damaging yet, not economically important, right?
Okay.
And the threshold was just the economic threshold, the space between the economic threshold and the injury level is pretty much how long it takes your control to work, right? And so if, the easiest example is sprays, because they work fast. And so if you spray too late, and the plant is already damaged, so even though you reduce the number of pests, if the plant is beyond repair or beyond saving, then you might still see economic injury. Or if, they may put out less fruit, or the fruit may be stunted because, there's a delay in getting in there and controlling those pest numbers, or kind of managing that pest damage.
Hi, Jermaine, can I ask you one question before we go? Just one
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
Please oblige me. I'm sorry.
Mhm.
Because I'm sitting here struggling to understand something about this graph. So I do understand the EIL is really bad, right? Like once you start getting above the EIL, there's something that needs to be amended, because essentially you're losing money and it's costing more money to control the pest problem. And then you have the ET, which, could you go back to the former slide
Yeah.
with the graph on it with just definitions, just so I
Yeah.
can make sure that I'm right. So the economic threshold or action population density at which control should be taken to prevent pests from reaching the economic, whatever hootie. So here's what I'm confused about. Below the EIL,
Mhm.
cost is greater than benefit.
Yeah, so
Why
Yeah.
wouldn't, okay, so to me, I'm reading this wrong, because what I'm seeing is I want it to be below the EIL because it's worth it. The benefit is worth the cost it will require to control pest.
Mhm.
So this statement is confusing me. Whereas above EIL, benefit is greater than cost. I don't see how the benefit is greater than the cost.
Yeah,
Because
so
EIL, you're losing
okay,
money.
so down here, your pests are not economically damaging yet. So if I spray at this level, I'm spraying at a level where they're not economically damaging yet. So I'm not getting any benefits for spraying.
Oh,
Yes.
benefit for using a pesticide, not just like benefit in general.
Yeah, it could be
Okay.
whatever, like, so if you want to till or whatever, there's a cost to tilling, there's a cost to going out and hand weeding, there's a cost to that, right? And so you have to balance that with the effectiveness you're going to get from it. And so this is what this graph is trying to capture.
So ideally,
Yes.
if I could have the best controls, right, I would want there to be a greater margin between that EIL and ET, which gives me more of
You
wiggle room, so to
Wh-
speak.
well, so yeah, you would want a greater space here because it gives your control more time to work. But to raise this economic threshold, you can use cultural practices, right? So remember, cultural practices create a plant positive environment, so your plants can tolerate damage, so they can tolerate more insects or more insect pressure before it becomes a problem. So that will delay the time. If this graph goes up, it will delay any kind of timing you need to go do something corrective.
So you're saying that if the cultural controls can be utilized in order to avert pest problems, whereas overly relying on pesticides of some sort to avert pest problems, which
Yeah.
inherently requires some sort of
Yeah.
financial investment, right? Some sort
Yeah.
of cost.
Yeah, so if you think about this in a monoculture, this line might go down because there's food everywhere. You know, it's pretty much a buffet for insects. They could double up and keep going. So the only way to control that is by spray. And with, you know, some may be resistant and survive that spray. So you see, you're going to have to keep spraying and doing things like that, and becomes kind of in a, it doesn't, it's not cost effective anymore. Yeah. So below the economic injury level, so under here, under this line, insects are not economically damaging yet. So this may look like one defoliated leaf or something like that because you have 2 potato beetles on your plant. But then when you get to here, if you have 6 potato beetles and half your plant is defoliated, you know what I'm saying? That might be up here where, you know, the pest population escaped. In this example, if your plant is half defoliated, then you might, there's a chance you could lose it, maybe not, depending on the plant. But that's kind of an example to kind of illustrate, like below this level where they're not economically damaging, they can take some the background kind of processes are taking place. Plants growing, they could compensate for damage. You have natural enemies in the background that are kind of keeping that economic threshold higher. And then, you know, as you're monitoring pest insects over the course of the growing season, if you see those numbers rising, and this is something you could develop over years. Like, for example, if, you know, if you've been gardening for 3 years and you notice that first year, oh, when I saw one Colorado potato beetle leaf and I put in control at this point, it still didn't save the plant. So you might think about, oh, I can't take an adult Colorado potato beetle, but is a larvae, you know. So you can kind of design your thresholds that way, and you can get advice through extension, through what the basic guidelines are. Sorry, you had a question,
I think Andrew has a question, and then we'll
Andrew?
one more question, then go to breakout rooms.
Mhm.
Yeah, so thank you. Just so one quick definition question, clarification, and then another question that sort of like is control in this case broadly defined as multiple types of interventions, or is it sprays?
So this could be any intervention, right? And so this can be if you're adding so someone mentioned you can buy lady beetles and put into your field, right? And so it takes a set amount of time to work, and it takes a set amount of time to kind of have that effect you want, you know, suppressing those pests. So when you think of an intervention, it can be any intervention that's reactive with a time to take effect. So a spray, tilling, anything like that. And they usually have a cost associated with implementing them. So buying beneficials, buying spray, buying fuel or renting equipment, and have a
Like
cost.
buying those parasitic wasps that I
Yeah.
tried to like hang on my cole crops that
Yeah.
didn't work at all.
Yeah.
Um,
And so thinking
Okay.
about that, you want a time when the adults are active with when the egg stage, or, you know, whether it's the egg or larvae stage is available, because if you apply them too late and they're going out to full adults,
Oh, I totally,
they're not going to work.
Yeah, I definitely applied them too late. They were like decimating all of my coal crops at that point.
Right. And so
Because they were all adults.
you probably applied here. So your economic
Yeah.
threshold is here, and you applied somewhere up here, and it was kind of too
Yeah.
late to catch up.
So sorry if I'm taking up some more time, but I had a related question about that, which was like for flower gardening. So let's say I'm flower gardening and like economic injury level and economic threshold. If I'm flower gardening personally, then like there isn't necessarily an economic level, I guess.
Yeah. And so in
Maybe
that
if you're
case,
thinking about it from like your own pocket, but like, yeah. So how do you determine what that threshold is, what that injury level is from that kind of perspective?
right. And in that case, I just think of So you're looking from an aesthetic purpose, right? Do you, if you're wanting, you know,
It could be aesthetic, or like thinking about it from a soil health perspective, from a plant health perspective, an ecosystem perspective, you know, that kind of thing.
yeah. So in that case, if you just want, you know, plants to survive and just be able to, you know, kind of reset every year and come in and bloom, then your threshold might be much higher, since you're not, you know, selling these plants for like ornamental purposes and they have to be in pristine condition. They could take some defoliation or, you know, disease here and there. As long as that stand is healthy and persists year after year, you're then this threshold can control. It would turn from an economic threshold to something like a lethal threshold or something. Like, you know, this plant can't take this many Japanese beetles or else it's not going to make it to the next year, where they're spreading disease at this density. So you could kind of, you know, adjust it towards that.
Is there like research out there that has like those kinds of that kind of information for like certain ecosystems? Like if I took all my plants from like, you know, they're all from the Piedmont or something like that, and that's the ecosystem that I'm trying to like mimic or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, is there research out there that sort of talks about that?
I don't know off the cuff. Generally, like, economic thresholds are tricky to come by, and usually they're for the, you know, crops or for selling or ornamental plants or something like that. You could develop them from you could kind of develop it from those. But as far as just, yeah, I'm not sure I would say what I'd say to that. Yeah.
All right, good questions,
thanks.
everybody.
Thank you.
Good questions. Thank you. I want to make sure we get some small group time.
Yeah.
So important to get time to talk in small groups. It's important for our learning and to connect with each other. So let's take 5 minutes, share any thoughts, questions, things that are coming up to you as we've been introduced to this idea of integrative pest management and the first few steps as part of this. So share in your breakout rooms for 5 minutes and we'll be back. See you all soon.
All right. Okay. All right. All right, welcome back, everybody. All right, so now up until this point, we talked about the first 4 steps of the IPM, kind of the steps in IPM. And so we talked about scouting and monitoring. So you want to make sure you know, you keep up with what's out there. So is there something I need to keep an eye on? Next is proper identification. So making sure you confirm that the pest is a pest. You know, is this what it is? Next was learning about pest biology. So, you know, what is it? What does it do? Then assessing the threat through thresholds. Is this pest a threat? And so next we want to talk about what do we do if there is a threat? And so now we'll talk about methods of control. And so integrated pest management consists of 4 different types of control. First is cultural, then physical mechanical, then biological, and then chemical. And so this IPM pyramid pretty much ranks these different control tactics in order from least toxic to increasing toxicity, or least risky to increasing in risky. And at the bottom of the IPM pyramid, these tactics are generally prevention based, and as you go up towards chemical and biological, those are more so intervention based. And we'll get into each one of these different types. So first up is cultural tactics. So cultural controls are a broad set of practices that reduce or deter the establishment, reproduction, dispersal, and survival of pests. So this is what I mean when I say create a plant positive, pest negative environment. Cultural controls focus on preventative rather than reactive approaches. So creating a plant positive environment, pest negative habitats. So when you learn about your pest dislikes, how can you use that against them in your planting system? Cultural controls focus on breaking up pest cycles, timing your plantings to avoid peak pest times, and diversifying plants to camouflage your cash crop, or providing resources to natural enemies and things like that. Cultural controls require a lot of planning and prior records to inform control implementation. So did my practice work last year? If not, how can I get ahead in the planning stage, and when I'm planning the crops for the new year? So it requires a knowledge of pests and plants. Some of these common approaches to cultural management include choosing your plant based on the appropriate climate. Anytime, every plant has a growing guide that says, the zone, the growing zones, or proper, watering conditions or sunlight and things like that. So you want to put a plant where it's in its optimal growing conditions, so it could grow healthy and develop healthy and be more defended against pests. Part of this is choosing resistant varieties. A lot of different agricultural crops have, resistant varieties that could be a little bit more resistant to, different pests or different diseases. Planting at the right time and proper site. So you also have recommendations of when to plant certain things. So you want to make sure you plant them in the proper places, the proper site. So is the soil appropriate for drainage? Is it getting appropriate sunlight? You want to think of all of these things when you're establishing and maintaining plants. You want to maintain your crop gardening equipment. Sometimes when you prune with gardening equipment, you can inadvertently transfer diseases or pathogens between plants. So cultural controls could be around maintaining gardening equipment, to avoid pushing pests from one area to another. Maintaining healthy soils. So healthy soils mean healthy plants, right? pH, different plants have different pH requirements. So, planting your crops in those required areas, those recommended areas. Some more cultural approaches, things like watering early in the day. Plants can pick up pathogens and things like that just by water splashing up onto it. Soil-borne pathogens can splash onto plants. So you want to, water at soil level or early in the day so that the water will dry up in between watering. Avoid overhead watering. This could be an entry point for fungus and molds and things like that if your plants are always wet. Using clean soil and seed sources, right? And someone earlier mentioned that a pest was transferred from another site, and through record keeping, you're able to track where it came from. So this is one of the important aspects of IPM. Maintaining healthy soil, through doing soil management, things like adding compost, organic fertilizers and things like that, keep soil in a healthy level. Proper drainage, so plants aren't waterlogged or stressed. Transplanting is also approach, so it's about avoiding a lot of that peak damage. And so if you grow plants inside to avoid its vulnerable seeding stage to be susceptible for pests. That's also a way to kind of give plants a head start. And so just to get in some very specific examples, one of the biggest, most popular examples of cultural control is crop diversification. And that just means diversity of plants in space and time. So you don't only want flowering plants next to each other, different species next to each other, you want them available over the course of the season because different beneficial insects and different organisms are available over the course of the season. And so these are a few different examples of crop diversification. So this first one is, you most likely see this on a farm or urban farm. So you might see a mat of cover crop residue. So a lot of beneficial insects. We talked about spiders, harvestmen, those kind of beneficial insects will be foraging through here. This is also good because it keeps the soil covered. It can retain a lot of moisture to prevent from drought stress and things like that. You have insect replanting, so bright showy flowers to serve a variety of different insects, and not only just beneficial insects and pollinator, but just you know insects that aren't just insects. They're not pests or beneficials. They're just hanging out. A lot of those kind of nondescript insects could be food for other animals like beneficial predators or birds and things like that that also attack rodents and other pests. Polyculture is another one, right? So mixing up what edible, or economically important plants you have, mixing them up. And so one of the advantages of polyculture is if you have an insect that only feeds on one plant, it's less likely to go on and attack others, or other plants can camouflage others, so insects would have a harder time finding them. So crop diversification is one of the major types of cultural control. Maintaining soil health. So when when plants are in healthy soils, they're healthy, less susceptible to disease and attack. So when proper nutrients are available, plants can make defensive compounds and different avenues to fight off infection. They could do compensatory growth. So if plants sense insect feeding on them, they can switch into compensatory growth and grow way more green matter so they can kind of tolerate it. Healthy soils also contain beneficial organisms, right? So earthworms, little defoliators that break down organic matter so the resources can be available for the plants you have growing. And another part of that is just maintaining optimal nutrient levels. Stress plants are more affected by stress. So they're less susceptible to pest attack. They're more susceptible to pest attacks when their plants are under stress. So you want to maintain and keep healthy soil. As far as watering and irrigation, right? So you want to avoid wetting plant foliage to avoid any fungal mold type disease. You can you want to avoid excess soil moisture by using irrigation tape that waters at the soil level. It won't splash onto it won't cause splash onto the plant crop leaves. So by avoiding excess soil moisture, you can avoid pathogens taking hold. And so with some of these irrigation tape, they only water a certain zone, right? And so weeds that are not being directly watered are less likely to come up in those spaces because the watering is in a controlled zone. And again, reducing splashing of soil-borne pathogens onto plants. Sanitation is a part of culture and control, right? So cleaning your farm equipment, things like your pruners, scissors, any kind of blade that are coming into contact with multiple plants, you want to sanitize those between plants because you can unknowingly transfer a disease between plants. So this is one of these a disorder in a cucurbit plant, right? And so if you clip this with pruners and then clip a healthy plant, there's a likelihood that you could transfer these disorders to other plants. So you want to make sure to clean equipment from of pathogens and weed seeds. Another part of sanitation is destroying sites to limit pest ability to reproduce. So when we talked about kind of knowing a pest biology, knowing nesting sites, so if they like overgrown areas or, areas with lots of crop debris or, junky areas, if you destroy those sites by cleaning them up, pests won't have the ability to come in and establish near, your cash crop or your ornamental plants. So next up is physical control. So as we're going up the different IPM pyramids, so there was cultural control at the bottom. So that's a lot of your environmental considerations. Next is your first physical line of defense, your physical and mechanical controls. And so physical controls include practices like, their practices involve directly killing or blocking pest access. So it's your first physical line of defense between your pest and your crop. This is generally less toxic than other controls like biological or chemical control, but it can be labor intensive. And so what are examples of physical controls? They include traps, like sticky traps, for example, can intercept flying insects and take them out of the environment. You have weeding. Weeding involves physically destroying or taking out weeds or weed seedlings from the space. Row covers, in this case, they can warm plants up and also keep insects out from getting in. But with row covers, you have to remove them to allow pollination. There's also tillage, so breaking up the soil to kill weeds or aerating the soil to kill any soil-borne pathogens. Further examples, mulching. So whether it's leaves or wood mulch, mulching physically blocks light from penetrating and germinating weed seeds. Mulches can also help retain water. Their hand picking approach, where you just, you go out there and, visually inspect for insects, and, if they're far and few between, you could just take them off the plant and crush them. Water sprays for certain, some of those immobile insects that have a harder time to get back to the plant after you spray them off. Water sprays may be effective. In some cases in the soil where there's soil-borne pathogens, you can put down landscape plastic to do soil solarization, where it heats up the soil to kill pathogens. And then there's mowing to kind of knock back any weedy plants or things that you don't want there. Next up, of the pyramid of controls is biological control. And so biological control is the use of an organism to control another pest organism. And so this is one of the keys to sustainable production, and it relies on that natural background activity of natural enemies. So natural enemies are always out there in the background, eating aphids or, doing that activity. So a natural enemy is any organism that kills, decrease the reproductive ability, or limit the activity of a pest species. And so with biological control, you want to manage the habitat to support natural enemies. So when we think of this, think about what these natural enemies like. They probably like their habitat to not be disturbed. So you want to limit disturbance around their habitats. You want to provide food, water sources, and refuge. So an area where they can hide out or reproduce. There's 3 general types of natural enemies. Those include predators, parasitoids, and pathogens. And so the first kind of natural enemies are your predators. So predators are any organism that feeds on and attack another animal. And this could be, they completely consume the other animal. And so in the insect world, you have your classic lady beetle larvae. Those are voracious predators of aphids. You have birds. Birds are very important predators that are going around, keeping insects at bay, attacking rodent pests. And then in some cases on farms, you have folks that use goats to manage weeds instead of herbicides, right? Goats or sheep can be trained to attack specific weeds. And just by the nature of goats being on your farm or around, they can significantly reduce your herbicide inputs. Next up are your parasitoids. So parasitoids are insects whose immature stages develop in or another insect. So these are often wasps and flies. Talked about wasps and flies last times, and these usually kill the host. And so this is a type of fly. This is a tachinid fly. And so going through the life cycle at the egg stage, that fly will lay an egg on a susceptible host. So this is a caterpillar. And so this egg is laid in a place where the caterpillar can't take it off, right? And so this egg will hatch and they bore down into the caterpillar's head. And you can kind of see these dark spots in here. Those are parasitoids inside the insect, eating it from the inside out. And so when they reach maturity, they'll pupate and then emerge as adults. And so this is a grasshopper that I found in the Beltsville Research Center years back. And I saw this grasshopper moving kind of funny. It's really slow and just disoriented. And a second later, this huge maggot popped out of it. So this maggot was growing inside of this grasshopper. And inside, if you look down the body, you can see its entire body is hollowed out. I have another picture here of parasitoids in action. So here is where parasitoid wasps attack these stink bug eggs. Let's see if I could get a video of it right now. 1 second. And so can you see this video? So this is a clutch of stink bug eggs. And so right here, you see this little wasp chewing its way out of this stink bug egg, right? This is the brown marmorated stink bug that we saw a couple slides back. And you see this, they have these darkened eggs. And you just saw 2 wasps climb out. Oh, there's a third one. And so as adults, they're going to complete the cycle. So you expect these to mate, sting a new set of eggs, and then complete this all over again. And so by doing this, they're taking stink bugs out of the equation. And so just real quick, some of the signs of parasitization. You tend to see the host is lethargic, so slow, non-moving. The host tends to change color, so the eggs tends to be darker. You see some dark coloration appearing on the host, and there's rough exit holes in the eggs or the body of the insect. Next up are your pathogens. So pathogens are generally disease-causing microorganisms, and they infect and eventually kill the host. And they're typically bacterial, fungal, or viral. And some of the examples include Bacillus thuringiensis. So this is now genetically modified into certain crops like corn and soybean. This is a soil-dwelling pathogen that's just naturally existing in the soil. Then there's entomopathogenic fungi. So entomo, like entomology, just means insect. Pathogenic means disease-causing. So disease-causing insect fungi that causes disease in insects. So this is a fly. It has 2 wings, but you see these fungal spores coming out of this fly. So this fly was infected by a fungus, it was killed, and now that fungi is reproducing to hopefully catch more flies. Then there's disease causing, so nematodes that cause diseases in insects. So entomopathogenic nematodes, this is a waxworm, and this is infected with these tiny nematodes. So they go in, consume it from the inside, mate, and then burst. And so these are called infective juveniles. So all of these are going to be looking for another insect to go into and complete that cycle again. So now I want to talk about the different kinds of biological control. Now we talked about the different types of natural enemies. And so the first is classical biocontrol. This was the approach of introducing an exotic species, so different, generally from another country or continent. This is a native natural enemy to control an invasive pest, right? And so, like, say we get an invasive pest, we go to where that pest was from to bring its predator to this country so it could do that control. But this is also risky because there may be non-target effects of this new predator onto local species. For example, the multicolored Asian lady beetle. This was brought up to control aphids, right? They're very good at that job, but they're also good at eating native lady beetle eggs and larvae. So in this way, it's a double-edged sword. The parasitoids of the brown marmorated stink bug around 2010, 2011 were introduced to help control the brown marmorated stink bug. But as we can see from that slide, there was 4 other closely looking stink bugs, right? So will those wasps attack those? And so classical biocontrol is generally at the government level, research level, where there's a lot of research and experimenting going on before something is released to try to control for some of that risk. So this is generally not going to be happening at your kind of at home level. Then there's augmentative biocontrol. So this is what we think of when we think of buying beneficial insects and releasing them into our garden. So this includes the purchase and release of beneficial insects into the landscape to help manage pests. So you could boost natural beneficial insect numbers. You can rescue plants from establishing pests. And these are often combined with cultural practices, right? And so if you're releasing beneficial insects into your environment, we just learned about what kind of habitats they like and what kind of resources they need to keep them around. So they're often combined with floral diversification, along with refuge sites to keep them around. There's 2 types of augmentative biocontrol, and that includes an inoculative type approach and an inundative approach. And so inoculative releases are when you introduce a low number of biocontrol agents to establish, and they'll be in the background for the rest of the season, right? And so the goal is to manage pests over the course of the season. Banker plants are an example of that, where you can release a pest, they could maintain on these banker plants, and a beneficial insect can be raised here, and then they move into the crop to attack pests on the crop. So here you have example of banker plants. This is a type of parasitic wasp that attacks Mexican bean beetles. And I'll talk a little bit about this guy, the minute pirate bug, which is available for purchase and release, and often used for things like soft-bodied insects like aphids, thrips, caterpillars and such. So inundative releases are rapid short-term management of pests by releasing a large population of natural enemies. So this is that, release, thousands or millions of biological control agents to get that rapid response. And this is kind of analogous to a spray, right? You release a lot of wasps or predators to try to get a quick return or quick control of pests. But this is often ineffective because it requires multiple re-releases, right? And this is useful when inoculative releases fail. So if you bought a small amount to release and they didn't quite take, you can often come behind later with a larger number to kind of bring exploding population back down. One of the very classic examples of inundative releases is for the whitefly in greenhouses. And this is a parasitoid that you can buy and release in the greenhouse. And they're good at kind of really bringing down whitefly numbers. And then the final type of biological control is conservation biocontrol. And so this is modifying the environment and cropping practices to favor beneficial insects while deterring pests. So again, that combines cultural and biocontrol approaches. And some of the common strategies around that that sounds familiar to you is diversifying vegetation and flowering plants, providing a water source, providing undisturbed buffer areas for pollinators or refuges for predators, using trap crops. So trap crops can limit the amount of sprays that you're putting into the environment. And then reducing broad spectrum insecticides and aim for selective or biological chemical pesticides. And so again, you remember this slide from last time. So just kind of looking at it in the context of a garden, right? And so some of the common strategies: diversifying plants. We know different types of insects or wildlife like different habitats. They need water during hot days. They need a pollen resource, nectar resources, carbohydrate that could keep them active and available to hunt down prey, provide undisturbed buffers so they can reproduce or overwinter. You want to provide banker plants or trap crops, and then overall reducing your insecticide, because there are a lot of predatory species or just kind of non-pest, non-beneficial insects that are a food source for the beneficial insects or organisms. And so now that I've talked about conservation biocontrol, I want to introduce a little bit of my work that kind of related to conservation biocontrol. So this is the minute pirate bug. It's a very good predator of soft-bodied insects. Remember, this is the life cycle. So it has this egg stage, it goes through 5 instars, and then has this adult stage. So what I wanted to do with my research is, since this is an important or economically important beneficial insect, I wanted to see if we can use flora resources to boost its abilities. So can flowering resources improve the ability of the minute pirate bug to survive, lay eggs, and attack pest insects? And so as a part of this, I was interested in researching 2 types of plants. One was buckwheat flowers. Buckwheat produces many showy white flowers, attractive to beneficial insects. They have these nectar glands here. So beneficial insects can get a drink of nectar. It could keep them going, especially during the time of the year when other flowering plants might not be available. So buckwheat for a flowering source. Cowpea is another type of cover crop that I wanted to use. Instead of since their flowers take around 90 days to bloom, I was more interested in these extrafloral nectaries. So at the base of their leaves right here, they have these little glands that produce nectar. And these are very beneficial for, pollinators, predatory insects, and things like that. And so as a part of this project, I developed 3 different treatments to raise minute pirate bug and to monitor the survival, the ability to lay eggs and attack pests. And to do that, there was a control. So we set them up in these Petri dish arenas where we add a little bit of habitat complexity with these little paper. Then we added these little feeding cards. It has eggs of the moth Ephestia cuinella. So I just call them moth eggs from here. And then it has this green bean. Green beans are an egg-laying substrate. And then it has this cotton wick of water so they could get a drink. But as I added the flowering resources, so there's a buckwheat plant in here where there's buckwheat leaves and flowers. There's also a green bean in there for egg laying. Then there was a cowpea treatment where there's cowpea leaves with the extrafloral nectaries. They have moth eggs and an egg laying slice of green bean. And then I wanted to see what diversification does. So instead of each one alone, what does one of each do for the insect, right? So you see cowpea with the extrafloral nectaries, and then you see the flowers on the buckwheat here, right? And so into each of these arenas, I put 10 insects, 4 were male and 6 were female, and I replicated it 9 times. And so every 24 hours, I checked on these arenas. I recorded the number of survival. Every 48 hours, I recorded the number of eggs, and you can look under the microscope and see these little eggs embedded into the green beans or the plant tissue. And then predation. So we use corn borer larvae in this one, so soft-bodied insects that they like to eat, and recorded the fate of these eggs. So we'll introduce these eggs and record it every 2 days. And so this is what corn borer eggs look like. There's these flat cream colored eggs, and then these brown ones, these brown flattened ones. So remember, this minute plant bug has that sucking mouth part. So it looks, these egg masses look like it got the juice sucked right out of it. And so that's an indication that this was attacked by a predator. So these are the different treatments, and this is how I took my data. And so first up is just showing some results from the survival. So on this x-axis, you have your percentage of insects surviving. And on the y-axis, you have the days after the experiment began. And remember, this is survival. And so what we have here is blue was that control. So no plant resources were provided. It was just water and green beans. And this is the blue line. So you can see at each day, when they just had the baseline requirements, there were lower survival compared to when they did get a plant resource, right? And so we see that when there's buckwheat or cowpea present, there's higher survival than just with the no resource control. But when I combine the two resources, I see a little bit higher survival on each day. So mean highest survivals tend to be highest when I have a diverse mixture of plant resources versus one. So looking at the egg laying, so on the y-axis, I have the mean number of eggs. On the x-axis, I have the days after the experiment began. And this is just the cumulative amount of eggs laid by these beneficial insects over 20 days. And so that blue line is control. So you could see with no flowering resources, you see far fewer eggs. When you get one plant resource, you see a dramatically higher number of eggs. So these are eggs of beneficial insects that can grow into adults and go on to attack pests. And then when we combine and find both buckwheat and cowpea together, you see that the mean number of eggs are highest in this control. So they're laying the most eggs when they have a variety of resources. And then finally, we have a picture of predation. So this is when I counted the egg masses for that damage. And so with the control, we got around 70% mean proportion of eggs attacked. Well, we noticed when we had buckwheat, so those many flowers, they didn't attack as many pests. So we're seeing that you have to balance the amount of food you provide so that they can still be hungry enough to go attack pest insects, right? So when they had the cowpea, so they didn't have as many flowering resources. Extrafloral nectaries produce a little bit less nectar. So you see similar numbers of predation between that and the control. But when you see that mixture of two, you kind of see that predation is depressed, right? So it seems like there's a little bit too much food resources here. So it's a reminder to balance how many resources you're putting into the environment for beneficial insect, because sometimes the resource that you're hoping can attract them to attack pests can just use to attract them, and it now become a sink instead of a source of beneficial insects. And just to quickly recap, this was research that I got published, and just to highlight the findings. When it comes to survival, we saw enhanced longevity, so enhanced survival with supplemental nectar, and diverse mix further enhanced their survival. When you look at fecundity, fecundity increased with supplemental nectar. So when there's a plant resource, they're laying more eggs. Most eggs were laid in the biculture. So we're seeing that, add cowpea if you want these insects to lay more eggs, because they were preferring cowpea. Remember when we talked a little bit about insects and their preferences for plant hosts? This is what we're seeing right here. And then with predation, the predation was lowered somewhat in the presence of buckwheat. So you might want to reduce the amount of buckwheat to increase the amount of cowpea next time. And so, after biocontrol, we have the last type of control tactics, and that's the chemical. And so chemical control is the use of pesticides to manage pests. This is the last resort after all the other different kinds of control tactics. Chemicals are generally fast, easy to use, and relatively cheaper compared to like the labor and equipment of cultural and biocontrol. Chemical controls can be harmful to humans, non-target species like birds, pollinators, bees, and things like that in the environment. Pesticides can travel through plants. Plants can uptake pesticide residues through soil. Pesticides can seep in through soil, can get into the water, and leak in different ways. So this is why this is generally a risky last resort option. And so when you do have to use a chemical pesticide, you want to aim to use the most selective and the safest chemicals. Some IPM strategies around using chemical controls. Use your personal protective equipment is must. You don't want, we just said that a lot of these chemicals can have negative impacts to humans, so you definitely want to be protected out there. You want to know what's on the pesticide label. So what are the active ingredients that's typically listed? What it's rated for, the groups of species, plants or insects or whatever that it's rated for. You only want to use the pesticides for what it's rated for. Generally avoid spraying when beneficials are active. So you want to spray earlier in the morning or at night after the winds have died down. You want to minimize the frequency of sprays and the total area of sprays. So this is where something like a trap crop could come in. So as a trap crop, you spray a smaller area less frequently than an entire area. Some examples of chemical controls include botanical oils or biopesticides like neem, pesticides, your synthetic pesticides like imidacloprid or glyphosate for weeds. There are different pheromone lures that can be used to attract pests to traps to take them out of the environment. So things like Japanese beetles or things like that. Then there's growth regulators, and regulators typically for insects, they impair the ability of an insect or plant to develop. So these are the effects of insect growth regulator on a cockroach. So you can see like their legs aren't fully developed, their bodies are distorted, and so they're not going to be fully functional adults that are active pests in your building or your crop or whatever. And so these are just some resources you can kind of reach out to or look for to kind of get basic guidelines around chemical controls. And then kind of after you're done with choosing your controls, one of the final steps is reviewing your management program. So did your slew of controls, were they effective? Were they worth the cost or the labor to control? Were there any unintended side effects? How can you adjust this strategy for next year? I'm going to use a different brand, use less, change my scouting, have you kept organized records? And so this is where a lot of those data sheets and record keeping sheets can really come in handy as you check from year to year, on the progress of your controls. This is a video that nicely sums up the principles of IPM. This is produced by the University of Maryland Extension, and it pretty much from top to bottom highlights that circle of IPM from identifying all the way to evaluation. So I encourage you to kind of take a look at that if you have any questions. And then I just have further resources in terms of IPM. And that's all for this section. Next section, we'll talk about some of the common pests in this DC area, how they're pests, and what are some commonly available controls from them.
Awesome. Thank you, Jermaine. We could take maybe 1 or 2 questions, then we'll go to breakout rooms. If there's anybody who has a question they'd like to ask first.
So with the plastic,
Excellent.
sorry, I was just gonna say, so I mean, I saw you were talking about like using the plastic to be able to keep some of the weeds down, but does that deteriorate over time, or is that
Sorry,
something
I
that's
missed the beginning part of your question. I'm sorry.
so you were talking about the plastic to put down for weed suppression. And my question was, with the plastic, does that deteriorate over time? And the residual effects of using plastic, I guess, for weed suppression versus using a tarp.
Yeah, definitely. Plastics, can break down, and so that's a part of the cost of using them that you evaluate. One, putting plastic in the environment. So for some growers, it might be a harder choice than not. But yeah, plastic can deteriorate between years, or you have to like take it out between years.
Right. So I was
Mhm.
saying, so I guess my second part to that is instead of using plastic, wouldn't it be better to do like tarp suppression or um, it's leaving my mind right now.
Landscape fabric.
Yeah, I was trying to
Yep.
think landscape fabric and what's the other thing? But like potato sacks, what potato sacks were made out of.
Mhm, mhm.
Isn't that kind
Is
of a
that
better
burlap? I
option?
think. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
burlap.
those are
Isn't-
options. Yeah, those are definitely options to consider. Um, and yeah, someone said for solarization, it's generally a shorter term thing. Um, trying to catch up to the chat here.
Yeah, I know there was a question in the chat too about if you could define what the banker.
Banker plants. So banker plants are pretty much a pest reservoir that you put in the greenhouse or nearby, and so this can serve as a as a as a as a prey source for natural enemies. So in this case, let's say you have the minute pirate bug that you're using in a greenhouse. You might have aphids or something like that that are not mobile. You know, these insects are mobile, so they can migrate to the banker plants. You know, suppress that population, but it's also keeping a stable prey resource. Because the thing is, on your cash crop, there may not always be enough insects to attack there. And so in those cases, insects may just migrate away from your fields, right? In some cases where you do a release of lady beetles, they might say, hey, there's not enough aphids here. Let me fly to greener pastures. So banker plants, those are typically in greenhouses, and that's a way of maintaining a small number of pests so that you can keep your predatory insect population from crashing or moving on.
So what is the difference between a banker plant and a trap crop?
Mm-hmm. I think typically I'd want to say those are pretty similar. I think when I think of cash crop, that's usually gonna be at the the field plot level, and I don't typically think you spray the banker plants, whereas with trap crops, you don't intend to harvest at all, and it's just meant to lure pests away, and then when the pests build up there, you can just spray it one time or a few times to kind of take those out of the population. But that's how I would consider it.
Thank you.
That helps.
Great. Thank you all. More good questions. Let's take 5 minutes in breakout room. So share any thoughts
Yeah.
of what we learned about IPM in this last section. All right, see you all back here in 5 minutes.
All right.
So it seems I'm stuck with you. So I guess I'll pick your brain why it's just us. So so I sometimes I try to figure out what is attracting certain bad pests because I strive to plant things that are deterrents like well, something killed my bay leaf, but like my bay leaf tree, marum and lemon balm and catnip and spearmint, and I have mojito mint and those type of things. But I still get not so much the sucky things, more the eaty things. Hold
This
on.
question's for Jermaine. Am I?
It was for you. I was saying, yeah, I was saying since I didn't get a breakout room, I figured I'd ask you a couple questions.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. So you say you're trying to, find the pests for those?
So I was saying that I tried to plant things to try to prevent the pest, the not the sucky ones, but the ones that like to munch, because that's
Yeah.
what I get.
Yeah.
this is my first time encountering, like I was saying, we've been looking, we took pictures. Uh, this is my first time encountering the ones that suck the nutrients out. I've always
Mhm.
encountered, the caterpillars and the white moth trying to lay her eggs. And I can kind of hunt and track it down and find the critters. Like that's what we did this time. We kind of went through and just checked each bed, and we were able to find one of the egg sacs,
Mhm.
and we were able to crush that and get rid of that, and then just really gave it a good spray with the BT Monterey. And what I was doing was trying to track where the white moth was more paying attention to, and that's
Yeah.
where I put the netting. And
Mhm.
then I just kind of moved it along from where I was watching, where it was more attentive. So what I was saying for like my farm, I tried to plant like the good plants that they say, the good bug plants to bring the good bugs,
Mhm.
and the herbs that bring the good bugs, but I still attract the moths and the
Those
caterpillars.
those two. And it's enough to be causing like that significant damage where it can't be ignored. There are
So I tried to put like sacrificial things,
mhm.
but they're still like coming around, and it's about to be that time of the year where it's warmer, and we have a lot of comfrey and potatoes and squash on my
Mm.
farm. So I start seeing them come more around this time of season. And we do the BT Monterey spray once a week,
Mhm.
trying to make sure we maintain it. But sometimes they're just super, like, especially the white moths are super.
So plants out of place, any plant species that you don't want there. There's pathogens, so the disease-causing organisms, that could be molds, fungal pathogen, rust on your plants. But there are also vertebrate pests, so your mammals like rodents and larger mammals. So starting with invertebrates, one of the biggest, most common pests are aphids. These are small insects with pear-shaped bodies. There's a picture of aphid here. So aphids can asexually reproduce, so that means they can clone themselves. So it's really important to keep on top of monitoring aphids because their populations can explode overnight if unchecked. So as far as their pest activity, so they use their piercing, sucking mouth parts to suck out plant fluids. So that can result in curling and stunted leaves, and also transmits viruses between plants by doing this. So you can see some of that leaf curling here. So if you see this in your garden, I guarantee you, if you turn that leaf over, you're probably gonna see a bunch of aphids in there going crazy. Aphids also produce this honeydew-like residue. So out of their back, they'll produce this honeydew residue that ants tend to like. And ants will protect the aphids because of that honeydew. So your lady beetles are less effective. They'll fight off lady beetles, stop them from eating off aphids. These are the things that's kind of happening in nature. Um, Another part of with aphids is that residue, that honey-like residue, can be a host for secondary infections like sooty mold when it's left behind on a leaf. And some of the management, so for management, I try to recommend multiple controls. So in the spirit of integrated pest management, you want to be combining and trying multiple different strategies. And so as far as biological controls, you have predatory insects like your lady beetles, you have parasitic wasps. So when the aphid is, does anyone know what it's called when the aphid looks like this? It's tan. There might be a circular hole in the back of it. Does anybody want to know what they're called? I don't know what chat is. Called aphid mummies. And so pretty much what happens is the parasitoid goes in, lays the egg there. Oh, it stings the aphid, lays an egg inside. It gets eaten from the inside out, and that kind of tan hardening color is evidence that you have parasitized aphids. So this is a good sign if you see aphids. That's a sign that natural enemies are in the background and they're working. Some of the cultural controls are reflective mulches. So that can deter aphids from colonizing the plants. Water sprays can dislodge aphids. They're not very mobile, so this could kind of prevent them uh, having a foothold in your plant. Exclusion is an option, so using row covers over seedlings to stop their early season colonization. And as far as chemical insecticides, there are insecticidal soaks that you can use to help take care of aphids. Um, Next up are invertebrates. Two-spotted spider mites. These are another big pest. These are tiny arthropods. They're not insects, so they have two body segments versus three that insects typically have. Two-spotted spider mites have 8 legs, so they're more related to spiders than insects. One of the distinct features is that they have these 2 black spots on their sides. So that 2 body segment, 8 legs. One of the things with two-spotted spider mites is that they could complete their life cycle in a week, and females can lay up to 200 eggs. So this is something that if it gets established, it could really spread through your greenhouse or your field or whatever. As far as pest activity, it does the stippling damage on the underside of the leaves. So when it chews into the plant, it leaves these little stippling marks. As damage gets more severe, you see a gradual yellowing. So plants become more yellow, and you see this brittle rusting of the undersides of the leaves. And your plant's lost when you see these webs forming. So they use these webs to protect them from predators, to allow them to move across the plant. And so this is not a good sign to have. As far as management, these pests typically get a foothold when plants are drought stressed. So you want to practice proper irrigation, optimal watering and drainage for your plants. Strong sprays of waters can dislodge um, you know, the mites. This typically more earlier in the season. As far as biological control, just predatory mites that you could purchase. So this is a predatory mite that's attacking a two-spotted spider mite. And then there's chemical insecticides, so insecticidal soaps and horticultural oils that can work for two-spotted spider mites. One of the insect pests, Japanese beetles, right? So these are half-inch meadow green beetles, and they have copper wings. Japanese beetles have over 300 hosts. They eat pretty much anything, and just last year they kind of totaled my rose bush. It still survived, but they chewed away a lot of the leaves. They're active during the summer months. So between now and August, you're gonna start seeing increasing numbers of Japanese beetles coming in. One of the things with this is that it's often cosmetic, and so while my rose plants did take a beating, it did survive, and it's looking much better this year. We'll see if the Japanese beetles attack it again this year. As far as activity, they defoliate trees, ornamentals, my rose bush, and lawns. So that classic chewing symptom of damage. So a lot of that defoliation can be a source of secondary infections. So now because the leaf is wounded, this is now an area where fungus or bacterial pathogens could get in. If there's like another insect or bird that spreads frass or poop near that wound, it can cause an infection in the plant. As far as management of the Japanese beetle, there's some trapping. Baiting traps with pheromone and placing them far from the other host plants on your property. There's cultural approaches, so pruning diseased trees, planting resistant flora. So again, pests are attracted to stressed plants. And so if trees are already diseased or under attack, it's more likely that pests can overcome those defenses than on a healthy plant. There's some biologicals available. So nematodes, remember, these are those tiny worms that burrow into the insect. eat it from the inside out. And there's biologicals like Bacillus thuringiensis available. And then there's different chemical formulations that can work on Japanese beetles. So I got these from extension guides. So bifenthrin, carbaryl for adults, and imidacloprid for larvals. And so moving from the invertebrate, sort of the non-insect and insects, we're going to talk about plants a little bit. Weeds are often pests in growing areas. One of the biggest ones, dandelions. So that's this perennial flowering weed. It blooms through spring and summer, and you typically see seedlings in the fall. And so one of the key characteristics of dandelion is that it puts out its leaves in this rosette shape, and each of their leaves have these deeply serrated notches in them. One of the things with dandelions is that if you weed them and if you just cut off the leaf part, they can regrow completely from their taproot. So when you're doing mechanical weeding, you want to pull that taproot all the way out of the soil, because if they survive, and they can release up to 15,000 seeds per plant. So we all familiar with the dandelion seeds. They travel across the wind and they can really spread out. As far as management, there's mechanical, so removing the entire plant, including the taproot. You want to mulch to keep the soil covered. And so this will prevent any dandelion seedlings from growing and competing with your ornamental plants or your crop. So when they're covered, they can't get sunlight to grow. As far as chemical controls, there are options available for lawns. But the dandelion does have value, right? And so early in the spring, it's a flowering resource for pollinators. So remember I talked about, I believe DC and Maryland, at least PG and Howard County has delayed mowing in the spring, so the pollinators can go ahead and get a little bit of a flowering resource or nectar resource in the spring before mowing later on in May. So it's kind of recognizing the value of some of those weedy species and what they do for beneficial insects. Other pests, crabgrass. This is a summer annual weed. So they tend to be prostrate or low growing. So they tend to grow along the surface of the ground. The seeds typically germinate through the spring and the summer when the soil temperatures tend to hit 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Crabgrass tends to like bare soil, stressed soil. So in your lawns and your gardens, this is where they could start to take hold. You see crabgrass seedlings like this in those kind of distressed soils. And so to manage this, you can do things like hand pulling, hoeing, targeting those seedlings, stop them from growing up. You want to, as far as cultural controls, keep soil covered to prevent these seedlings from growing into the ability to set seeds or reproducing. So keeping soil covered or seeded, maintaining dense turf or mulch, and you want to mow lawns to keep it low to prevent it from establishing. As far as chemical controls, there's pre-emergent and post-emergent herbicides available. So those are two of the common weeds. And this is just to show a range of the different pests, right? And so next is pathogens. So we talked about insects, we talked about plants. So now let's talk about diseases, right? Pathogens. So bacterial wilt is a disease pathogen that's typically in cucurbits. So your melons, your squash, cucumbers, things like that. So what this bacterial disease does, it blocks up the vascular tissue of plants, so it stops plants from being able to transfer water effectively. And so this pathogen is spread when poop is spread between open wounds due to cucumber feeding. So we see cucumber beetles are these chewing predators. They'll chew all of these holes into the squash plant, but they also defecate there too. And this is an entryway for that bacterial pathogen to get in. So they're vectored by cucumber beetles. And cucumber beetles tend to hide out under the leaves and in flowers. So remember when I talked about scouting, you want to check under the leaves, in flowers for all those typical hiding spaces. Bacterial wilt usually means the death of the plant. So this is something you want to get in front of early. And you can manage this by managing cucumber beetles. One of the telltale signs to look for bacterial wilt, you'll see a very wilty plant. And when you cut it and you pull the two stem pieces apart, you'll see this mucousy like stringiness coming from between the plant. So that's one of the telltale symbols of bacterial wilt. Some of the ways to manage this, sanitation includes roguing and burying infected plants. That way you can avoid any further cucumber beetles eating, chewing on the leaf and spreading that to a healthy plant. There are cultural approaches. So for example, trap cropping. So that involves luring cucumber beetles away from your cash crops or your valuable plants. There's exclusion methods. So things like row covers can prevent cucumber beetles from accessing the plant, but you have to remember to take away the row cover to allow the flowers to be pollinated. More pests, powdery mildews. There's these different species that each attack specific plants. They can attack vegetables, mature ornamentals, and often landscape plants. And they show up as these white powdery spots on leaves and shoots. And so with this, plant parts will gradually yellow and die. And so some of the management around this is cultural. So, powdery mildew, it's a type of fungus or type of mold. So um, molds like moisture, right? And so cultural practice could be widening plant spacing so that airflow can get between plants to reduce the humidity, reduce the ability for funguses to get in and take place. Plant in sunny and ventilated area, managing moisture, using resistant varieties of plants can all be some of those early considerations that you put in place when thinking about, powdery mildew. Then there's also sanitation. If you have an infected plant, you want to prune those infected parts and dispose of those crop residues so they can't inadvertently spread to healthy plants. There are chemical plant horticultural oils that can be used to help against powdery mildews, and those include things like neem, jojoba oil, and sulfur. And so those were some of the insect, weed, and kind of pathogen pests. Next, I want to talk about some of the more large or animal type pests. And so vertebrate species may also become pests, especially in urban areas. And urban areas are categorized by high human density, lots of human garbage, food waste. There's often abandoned buildings or damaged buildings that can open up cracks and crevices where rats or mice can get in and start a house there or habitat there. So large animal pest control often focus on non-lethal means such as physical or cultural controls. And in DC, many of those lethal forms of control are restricted unless it's by a licensed professional. So some of those restricted controls are toxicants. So you're not allowed to poison birds. So leg hold traps, you're not allowed to use body gripping traps or snare traps. You could think of non-target mammals, things like a deer or a dog or cat accidentally getting caught in something like that. There's no wildlife control on reptiles and amphibians as well. So yeah, again, looking at that IPM pyramid, so starting out with design type, maintenance type approaches and physical mechanical approaches. And so chemicals are generally restricted for professionals or over-the-counter traps or something like that. Mice are the first vertebrate pests. They're widespread small rodents. They tend to be between 5 and 8 inches in length. They have this long hairless tail. So rats are typically found in forest and field burrows. Man-made structures can also look like burrows if you have like abandoned building or overgrown backyard or something like that. One of the evidence is their droppings, and so their droppings are pointed in the size of a rice grain. Mice typically eats berries, seeds, fruits, vegetables, but they're generalists, so they can go for human foods as well. As far as pest signs and activity, you want to look for dug up garden beds, chewing marks around your structure, a urine odor coming around your structure. And as far as management, you want to do sanitation. So cleaning up its access to food, those crumbs, dog food is a target for rats and mice. So you want to take that away when it's not in use. There's exclusion, so seal cracks and openings less than a quarter inch. Mice are tiny and they can squeeze through really small openings. So you want to, caulk or seal whatever those openings so they can't get through. As far as physical approaches, there are traps. There's humane neck snap traps. There's sticky traps and things like that available. Um, as far as cultural controls, again, fixing leaky faucets. A leaky faucet can provide water source and beneficial insects like water sources too. So they can also have pests taking advantage of it. So you want to fix any leaking faucets, standing water. You want to keep your yards managed. Rat mice like overgrown areas. As far as biological controls, a lot of mice are eaten by cats and predatory birds in our area. Then you have your rats, so the larger cousin of mice. So rats tend to be much more widespread and larger than mice. They tend to be 13 to 18 inches. They have these raisin-sized, blunt-shaped droppings. And so this kind of, remember when I talked about IDing your pests, you want to know you have the right pests. One way to do that is by the droppings, right? Since you're not likely to see a rat or mouse because they tend to hide from humans. So mice droppings tend to be smaller than a grain of rice and tend to be pointy at the end, whereas rat droppings are much bigger and blunted. So this can give you a lot of information about what you have by just looking at the what's left behind. So rats inhabit burrows, home foundation, field and garden burrows. As far as a diet, omnivorous, they eat anything. As far as pet activity, gnawing marks near your housing structures or near food structures, around trash cans and things like that. You'll see tracks and rubbing marks along walls, so like a greasy residue along your baseboards or along the base of the walls. You can hear noises inside the walls. Those are signs of rats inside your walls. And as far as trapping, just snap and glue traps, exclusion, seal those cracks. As far as cultural controls, managing that environment, getting rid of clutter, low-lying weeds, leaky pipes, anything that they can take advantage of, you want to get rid of that. Sanitation, you want to store food or trash in secure containers that can't be breached by mice or rodents. There are rodenticides available, but they can be risky for non-targets, thinking of your animals, your pets, your dogs, and things like that, kids. You don't want them to get into this. And DC does have a rat riddance initiative, so you could click through that if you want more information on that. There's also squirrels. Squirrels are another rodent. So widespread tree-dwelling rodents that inhabit trees. There's these short, thick rodents, rodents with thick fur and a distinctly bushy tail. Their diet is seeds, nuts, acorns, fungi, insects, even flower bulbs. So you see them here kind of digging up an ornamental flower pot. Pest activity includes attacking trees, gardens, other crops. So if you have produce, they might go for your tomatoes or something. They can strip tree bark. So if you have ornamental trees, they often chew on wires, irrigation tubing, your row covers, nettings, things like that. They can disrupt or destroy human structures like the siding of homes and collect acorns in them. As far as management, there's exclusion, so screening and blocking entrances, securing your structure with chicken wire to prevent like them from disrupting the soil, kind of burrowing into the soil. You can anchor the soil with chicken wire so they can't get through. Tree collars could prevent squirrels from climbing. As far as cultural controls, cut back trees to slow movements. For example, if you have trees with limbs over your house, squirrels can use that to get over to your house, come down your chimney and things like that. You want to remove bird feeders because lots of squirrels like to take from bird feeders. And there are even anti-climb barriers that you can put on bird feeders to make them fall off or slide off. There's different things to kind of keep them at bay. You also have your raccoons. So between 2 to 3 feet and 10 to 30 pounds. These are nocturnal pests. They typically inhabit burrows, dens, abandoned kind of structures under porches. They're also omnivorous. They eat a wide variety of fruit, vegetables, pet food, nuts. They eat insects, but they also frequently raid human structures. So, probably all of you have seen a raccoon in your trash can or a possum or something like that hop out your trash can. And they do vector rabies, right? And so you don't want to be in close contact with rabies often because they can pass on disease to humans. And some of the management strategies include exclusion, so securing your food, sanitizing those areas, taking away their food resource. Typically, we trap and relocate raccoons. So if you have a raccoon problem, you could typically call ASPCA. And they'll come around. I think it's ASPCA. They'll deliver a trap and you can bait it, and they'll come pick it up if you catch something, and they'll relocate it. Groundhog, similar pest similar to raccoon. They're related to squirrels. Live along forest edges near open fields. They can grow up to 2 feet, 10 pounds. They have these powerful digging claws, and they can kind of burrow underground human structures, be a pest that way. They tend to be active in early spring and they hibernate in fall. These are generally herbivorous. They can eat any plant material and they often eat insects, and they build their burrows under your garden sheds or other structures. And as far as managing these, you can use sturdy fences to prevent entry. Electric fences are available with a wire, with electric fence wire 4 to 5 inches off the ground. So when the groundhog come into this, contact with this, will give them a slight shock and deter them from growing any further. You could place a trap baited with fruit or vegetable, you could capture them and relocate them. We generally don't kill them. And then I believe the last ones are deer, large vertebrate pests. They're widespread and overpopulated in many urban areas. They're herbivorous. They tend to eat buds, leaves, stems, and fruits of ornamental plants and food plants. Um, Adults may damage trees with their antler rubbing, so you could kind of see scraping away the bark of this tree. And as far as management, you can use sturdy, tall fencing to prevent them from jumping over it. There's different deer repellents that you can use. You can use electric fences baited with peanut butter or something like that. They'll get a shock on the nose and then leave. And then there's deer resistant native plants. So I provided a list there of native deer resistant species that you could consider putting in if you're interested. And next, I just have some IPM resources. So the Northeastern IPM Center is a good resource with different field guides. University of California IPM has extensive fact sheets. And so even though it's California, they have similar species and things like that and similar guidelines. University of Minnesota Extension has a plant disease page with identification resources. University of Extension, Maryland Extension has some pretty good resources. And this is just there to check out if you want to use this PowerPoint as a reference. There's an extension handbook with the damage control with wildlife, for wildlife. So your larger vertebrate pests, So what do you do against, owls or whatever, whatever vertebrate pests you have? Those will cover some of those. And then finally, I just wanted to summarize integrated pest management. So in summary, IPM is a systematic approach to managing pests, and it chooses from multiple options. So cultural, mechanical, chemical, and biological. It focuses on economical and sustainable pest suppression. So how, you can manage a certain level of pests up to a certain point. And it's not necessary to apply a control before that. So IPM is focused around minimal impact on human health, the environment, and non-target organisms. And that includes a focus on prevention, so prevention through a lot of that cultural control, a lot of identification and monitoring to keep track of pests and whether or not you need to implement a control. And that's all I have for today. I welcome any questions if you have any.
Maybe I'll make some quick announcements and then we
Yeah.
might have a minute or two left.
Alright.
Yeah, let me share my screen real quick. All right. Okay. Oops, sorry. Let me, just a reminder. Oop, there we go. Just a reminder about the final test coming up soon, and wanted to, if you, I know I've reviewed this in other classes. So if you have any questions, let me know. And this will be in the slides for today. So you can also reference this information. Coming up, you all will do great. A reminder about class this Saturday. So it's from 9 to 12. It's our first class on fruit and vegetable gardening, and hoping it can be at East Capitol Urban Farm, but also if air quality looks like it's not going to be great, we'll move it to Van Ness instead, and we'll be inside. So I'll let you know by the latest Friday morning where we'll be. So please do, because it's very possible we're going to shift it to Van Ness. So keep an eye on your email to check where we'll be on Saturday. And a reminder that this Friday, we're going to have a golden demonstration. So if you're having any trouble and want to get an overview of how to log your hours on Golden Volunteer, join us this Friday from 12 to 1. Michelle's going to do a demo, then she'll do a Q&A, and we'll record it as well. So if you have, if you're not able to come, you can watch it at another point. And there are a bunch of upcoming hours, a bunch of opportunities coming up soon. So keep an eye on the Master Gardener website too, ways to get involved. A new one that we added now is the Food Hub location in Ward 8, that Mac, I don't think he's here today, but he works the hydroponic system there. And there's also a community garden. So they now have volunteer hours as well. So you're welcome to join them for those as well. And I think, yeah, that this is in case we have to go to UDC. I'll share directions. But we have a few more minutes. So if you want to ask Jermaine some final questions before we wrap up, you could either, or there were a few questions in the chat. Maybe we could address those first. Did you see those, Jermaine? There's one.
Yeah, so so roguing is like a tool you use to pry out the root of it's like a single bladed tool you use to like get to the roots of a plant. So you want to like push it under the plant to get that taproot out, to get the entire plant and root system out. And reflective mulch is a reflective, thanks Rebecca for answering that. It's a reflective sheet, so sort of like it is that kind of in the ground plastic, but it's reflective. And so some insects use like the contrast between the soil and the plant to locate plants. And so when you disrupt that with a reflective mulch, it can disorient insects from finding that plant. So that's what reflective mulches are. And yeah, I'm always happy to come through and do courses for Master Garden. So I'm happy to do the lectures for you guys. I love the love.
Well, thank you so much, Jermaine. If everybody could write in the chat or come off mute and shout out some appreciation.
Thanks, Jermaine.
You're
Thank
very
you.
welcome.
Thank you.
And I hope y'all have good luck out there with your pests and with your pest management. It can be hard, but you know, you just got to keep on with it, you know?
I appreciated how
Thank
you said
you.
in
Yeah.
like every season it gets better. You
Yeah.
realize what you did wrong last season and then
You
you
know,
try to do it different the
mean,
next. I appreciate
you
that.
know, I'll share another story. Last year, I made the idiotic mistake of bringing soil from outside inside for my plants. So we had a fungus gnat problem in my house for a year. And so I had to dump all my plants and sanitize the soil and get, you know, because they were laying eggs in the soil and they're constantly in there and turning over. So, but I no longer have them. So this time I'm focused on my rose bush and those Japanese beetles. We'll see what happens this year.
Yeah, they're tough. Cool. Thank you so
All right,
much.
everyone have a good one. Have a good night. Good luck with the future classes and y'all take care. It was a
Thank
great
you so
time.
much.
Thanks,
Take care.
Jermaine.
All right, bye-bye now.